Thank you. Great to be here.
Great to have you here. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous fall morning up here in New Haven. I'm looking out at New Haven Harbor, and my son is visiting. I went out for a bike ride this morning. What's the weather like down in Jacksonville, right? Fort Lauderdale. I'm trying to remember where
No, you're
you're
right. We're
based.
in Jax.
Yeah, yeah.
Same. I'm looking out over the intercoastal. It's a gorgeous sunny day for us, fall, so in the 70s. And my
Don't
son's actually
remind me.
coming to visit next week as we
Nice.
U-Haul to get up to his first condo. So we're on the similar plane. I see
Awesome.
here. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, had a chance to chat a couple of weeks ago, and we share a common love of thriller mysteries. And I was sharing with you how much I enjoyed the book you shared with me, and
Awesome.
it's amazing. We'll talk a little bit more about that because I've got a question for you in terms of how the plot line from some of those books might impact the way you lead. But let's start at the beginning and
Okay.
talk a little bit about you. Tell me, where you grew up and what your early life was like. What part of the
Sure.
country and mom and dad.
Yeah, I grew up in upstate New York, up in
Okay.
Syracuse.
Nice.
One brother, year younger,
Hmm.
mom and dad, and the yellow lab, all the good stuff until
Mom and
really,
dad in the yellow lab. I love
yeah, till seventh grade.
it.
Then mom took off, and it was the three men, and I have to tell you that wasn't the worst way to grow up in high school either. And so that was it. Just kind of a basic upbringing,
Yeah.
nothing crazy or too
Yeah.
exciting.
Good student in school?
Very good in high school. That
Yeah.
changed a bit in college.
Okay. We'll get into that in a bit.
Okay.
But what about growing up? Odd jobs, any entrepreneurial things, have the ubiquitous paper route? What kind of things were you doing as a kid?
Yeah, a little bit. My dad, he was actually the president of Pepsi in upstate New York, three
Oh,
bottling.
right.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's kind of neat in consumer products, and
Right.
but he instilled a work ethic. So certainly I had the odd jobs, I'd paper route and stuff like that. That not my own, that I would fill in for people, and then there were these farms you could go to and do some labor. But he had
Mm.
me pretty busy. He's really not a man that believes much in entitlement. So I had, I think, 7 or 8 hours I had to bang out every week doing the yard. And upstate New
Good.
York, you have big yards, and of course, he wanted everything bagged, so that was a tedious effort. But
Oh, yeah.
it was a good lesson.
You had the season, snow on the ground there as well, I'm sure, in the
Oh,
wintertime.
absolutely, snow
Did your
blowing
did
and the
your share of
shoveling, and
plowing? Yeah.
for sure, you betcha,
Good.
you bet.
What about other influencers, folks, that you remember either as teachers or coaches growing up that had an impact and influence on your early life?
Really, when I think back to the early life, it just boils down to my parents.
Yeah.
And that might sound a little bit cliched. Of course, I had some great teachers like everybody, and coaches were a little tough, so that was probably good in many ways
Right.
as well. But I think, what I find interesting is my dad was all business and
Yeah.
very successful, and my mom was all heart and
Oh,
philanthropy,
good
and
balance.
maybe that's why it didn't work out for them. But I feel like I have influences from both of them, which have resulted in how I lead and manage and treat people.
Was your dad a long-term Pepsi employee, kind of
He
going up
was
through the
for a
ranks
while.
there?
It was actually
Yeah.
Pepsi bottling.
Pepsi
So
bottling. Right.
yeah, but then he left, and he was an entrepreneur and did his own
Oh,
thing for a while. So I saw some ups and some pretty lows, downs, some big downs as well from that regard, and his resilience and just I lost him unfortunately a couple months ago, but just an
oh, sorry
amazing
to hear
guy.
that.
That yeah,
Yeah.
thanks. We've all suffered in these last few years
Yeah. Yeah.
majorly, but just a man of great integrity and
Mhm.
still a loving dad, not austere by any stretch of the
Yeah.
imagination, but
Yeah.
very different from how my mom saw the world.
What did you think if you thought back and tried to distill it down? What's kind of the lesson that you took away from Dad in those early days?
Integrity, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, I
Keep your
remember
word.
getting, we were playing Parcheesi, if anyone knows what that game is.
Oh,
I'll
sure.
never forget this moment.
You're dating yourself, Doug, but I
Yeah, I
do know what
know,
Parcheesi
totally.
is.
So people are Googling Parcheesi, and it's not even coming up. But I called him a cheater,
Ah,
he swiftly spanked me and told me how serious it is to accuse a man of something you're not
right.
sure of, and
Yeah.
that was the last time, I assure you.
What about sports, or other types of outside activities? What did you keep yourself
I
busy
would
with
say
after school?
mediocre athlete.
Hmm.
I growing up was probably better until I got to the high school ages where people were just far more talented than me. So I played a lot of soccer, but then when I got to high school, I wrestled.
Oh,
Not
okay.
a big guy, so I couldn't play
Yeah.
football or any of that stuff, and so wrestling was a pretty good. I didn't really enjoy it during season. I loved it after season, and it
Right.
was grueling and terrible during. But it taught me a lot, and it
Yeah.
kept me busy.
You're kind of a wiry guy, right? So
I
you're able to
am.
move around a little bit and get
Yeah.
those moves, get them into those half Nelsons, and
Or be subjected to them, if I'm being honest. So
Now, was it a foregone conclusion that you go on to college, Doug? Did Dad
it
have a
was.
college education? Mom as well?
Yeah, that's just kind of how it was,
Yeah,
where we grew
yeah.
up in with my folks, for sure.
And how did you go about making the decision about where to go to school?
I really wanted to go to the Naval Academy, and I didn't
Yeah.
get the congressional
Oh, right.
nomination.
Yeah.
And so, actually, up in Connecticut, there's a guy that was helping with college counseling before that was a big, big thing. And my
Right.
dad took me to him, and his son was actually at Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt had a great Navy ROTC program. And so he said, you ought to look into that. And my dad's
Ah,
whole thing was expand your
right.
horizons, get out of your comfort zone, get out of upstate New York, get out of the Northeast. And it eventually led me to Vanderbilt, where I actually did
Mm,
not do the Naval ROTC program, but
right.
it was one of the first draws.
Great school. It,
It's an amazing school
yeah.
now. I
Yeah.
tell everybody, if we're being really honest, the requirements to get in 30 years ago weren't anywhere where they are today. So I like the
I say the
cachet it
same thing.
has, but I've got to be honest, it
I
wasn't.
went to a state school, and I don't think I'd get in there now either.
Oh, it's
Things have
crazy, isn't it?
changed
It's just
so
insane.
dramatically. And did you try to do college wrestling or college sports at all, or was
No,
that
no,
yeah,
not at
yeah,
all.
right?
No.
And what was your field of study?
Well, I started as an English major, and then
Okay.
I bounced over. You asked about influences. I found a teacher, Professor Aiken, who was just amazing, and
Yeah.
it was a relatively esoteric field for most, I would think, how they'd consider it. But it was history of Latin America, and I just fell in love
Oh,
with it. And so I took Spanish and history and Russian language and Russian history. I had
wow.
designs of becoming a CIA officer or an FBI agent or something like that, and that was the path I took. So I got out of Vanderbilt with a history of Latin America and Russian studies
Got it.
degree.
Got it. Cool. Cool.
Yeah,
And so
kind
you
of
were there all
different.
4 years. And then did you go on to get a master's, or did you pass that up
Well, I
along the way?
did,
Yeah.
probably for the wrong reasons. Honestly, I got out and said, boy, that GPA is not exactly going to land me the job I'm hoping for.
Hmm.
And I actually ended up on an airplane with an FBI agent and
Oh,
talked to him like, oh my gosh, this is my dream. And, what are you guys looking for? And I started sharing my experience. He said, actually, we've got a big need for people in human resources,
huh.
which was interesting because Vanderbilt
Yeah.
had just come out with a new program. Back then, we used to call HRD, Human Resource
Right.
Development.
Right.
So I went on and got a master's in HRD, which is organizational development and learning and training and all that kind of stuff.
And you did that back to back right after you
I
finished
did,
your
I
undergrad.
did,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And then what was that first job you took coming out of school?
Well, I guess having the consumer products blood in me, I went down. My wife was pursuing a PhD down at UF. We met at Vanderbilt. She wasn't my wife at the time, but at any rate, so I followed her down there. I was looking for a job, did some waiting jobs, and finally landed with Pillsbury,
Hmm.
where I was just a sales rep in a territory in Florida for Pillsbury.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. And did you have aspirations to go into HR there at that time, or just kind of enjoy the marketing part of what you were doing, or sales and marketing, I guess, at that time?
Yeah, it was mostly sales, honestly, not
Yeah.
that sexy, going literally grocery store, making sure your SKUs are up and trying to sell them on the greatest Pillsbury Doughboy frosting and stuff like that.
Right.
So
Right.
not really an opportunity to utilize the HR per se. However, a lot of transferable skills from that
Yeah.
program that led to, I would say, sales success and leadership success as well.
Now, was it at that company that you first started managing people, or a little bit later on? Tell us about
Yeah, it
that.
was at Pillsbury. A
Okay.
couple promotions where I wasn't
Yeah.
managing people, and then they moved me up to Minneapolis, not headquarters. That's where headquarters was, but they moved me up
Right.
there for a territory, and that was my first foray into managing people. I think at age of
Kind of a
25 or
district
26.
manager, district sales manager,
Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What were some of the challenges you had in that first kind of management, environment?
I think the biggest for me was establishing credibility because I was
Mm.
this young kid, and most of my team was comprised of guys about my age now,
Right.
55.
Right. We're senior. Yeah.
Yeah, very senior. And then some really just dynamic young women who were going to go just trailblazing through the organization. So kind of the balance between the two. And honestly, having this sense that I was supposed to know everything, and I sure as hell didn't, and some of the insecurities that come along with that.
Right.
So yeah.
And did you have some mentors early on? I know Pillsbury. As you know, I think I started at Procter and Gamble, and kind of a similar consumer products background. And I recall a lot of folks that kind of helped guide me along the way. Was that kind of an environment at Pillsbury in those early days?
It was, and it's a great analogy to P&G because you recall how extraordinary the training was and how
Yeah,
much they
yeah,
actually put into us back then. So you got the training, but then of course it was followed up by people who'd been very successful in higher roles, and so the
right.
mentorship programs there. And then I went to Conagra also in consumer products, which is really outstanding.
Yeah, yeah, terrific. We kind of growing up in that environment, and I was about 8, 9 years at Procter, and I think the combined time at Conagra and Pillsbury was about a decade for you. Was that
It
about right,
is,
Zach,
yeah,
between those two?
correct.
And there's mentors, but there's also tormentors. And one of the things that I always like to ask, and no names need to be mentioned, but
Sure.
did you observe some behaviors during those days when you said, oh man, boy, I'll tell you, that's a really tough way to manage, and I certainly ever want to do that. Any observations that you made during those early days about, how not to develop and manage people?
Honestly, I was super blessed. I mean, I've heard
Yeah.
about these tormentors, and I've never personally had a tormentor. I've
You're
been really
you are
lucky.
blessed.
I know, I'm definitely in the minority. Now, look, as I got a little bit older, and look, Pillsbury wasn't an organization that tolerated that either,
Yeah,
so I think
yeah,
that was part of it.
right.
Nor was Conagra. However, obviously, I've seen managers with whom I would not want to associate or work for, and I guess if you ask me what that common denominator was that made them bad, it was just ego, and I
Right.
think ego can be very
Yeah,
pernicious.
yeah.
Um, and so, yeah.
And you kind of went on from there and kind of got back into staffing. I want to get to Beeline because I know you spent the majority
Hmm.
of your career there, but I think you had an interim step, right,
I did.
in a staffing group. Tell us a little bit about that transition, how you kind of came out of that sales of consumer products into the staffing industry.
Sure. Well, I was down in Jacksonville, where Winn-Dixie's headquartered,
All
and I was
right.
just
Yeah.
ready to make a change, and I had a real desire to run a sales team. And a friend of mine was coming down to Jacksonville to run scientific staffing, so a division of
Okay.
the MPS group at the time.
Right.
And so we just connected. I said, I'm really looking for change. I'd love to manage a whole sales organization. And he said, that's interesting. I actually need that. So he hired me on to do that for a couple of years.
Yeah. Yeah. And tell us a little bit about what you guys did. Were you an outsourced staffing recruiting organization, or working in more in the technical field? Give us a little bit of an overview of
Yeah,
that.
it was more the Quest Diagnostics of the world, or the
Okay.
J&Js that were looking for scientific contractors.
Right.
But
Right.
look, truth be told, we were quite unsuccessful. When I came on, it was the recession hit, and then 9/11 hit shortly thereafter. And
Tough.
unfortunately, my experience was putting together all these great plans that never really effectuated. I was shutting down offices, and
Oh.
yeah, not really my best of times. And
Yeah.
then MPS Group ended up selling it to Kforce.
Okay, got it. And then did you continue on with that, or was that the time that you made your exit?
No, that's when
Okay.
they asked if I wanted to move on with the organization or stay with the MPS group, and if stay, what would you be interested in? And we had a really neat CEO, brain. He was the father of Beeline. Beeline was his brainchild,
Ah,
and
okay.
so I went up and had some discussions with him, and he said, where do you see yourself? And I said, honestly, I don't really know anything about technology, but I'm really enamored with this solution that you've got out at the beach. It was a different location,
Right.
and I'd love to do something there. And he said, well, it's nascent, and it's only, I don't know, 25 people there right now. We need somebody in product management. Why don't you go run product management? And I confessed I didn't know anything about that. And he said, look, it's not that hard.
Good idea, but
Yeah, that's right.
tell me more.
Yeah, it sounds fun. And he said,
Yeah,
you figure it out. Get out there. You'll figure it out. And that's where I started with
that's
Beeline. That's how I
awesome.
started.
And that was about 20 years ago, right?
It
19,
was,
20
yeah,
years
about
ago.
21, as a matter of
And
fact.
how big were they at the time?
Oh gosh. I mean, we had no revenue. Certainly weren't profitable, and like I
It
think I
was
was
really
maybe.
truly a startup at
It,
that
it
time.
was, yeah.
Wow,
And in
wow.
fact, the original idea was to be a marketplace, which is kind of interesting because I think that was very thoughtful and prescient. But of course, now we're seeing marketplaces evolve. But 21 years ago, it just wasn't so much of a thing.
Right, right. Cool. Well, and tell us again then how, well, really, maybe we just start with where Beeline is today. It sounds like it's evolved significantly over the last 2 decades.
It has.
What do you guys do? Who do you serve? Give us kind of a thumbnail sketch of the organization, your size and scope.
Sure. In essence, we sit between the Fortune 2000 and, for the most part, staffing firms, although that's
Right.
starting to evolve and change. And we're just technology. We don't provide staffing or services from that regard, but we automate the processes that are associated with that. And obviously, we introduce rate cards and visibility in terms of what you're paying and where the talent is and how to get the talent. There's a lot of compliance, as you well know, that's necessary in
Sure.
our industry that we,
Right.
we help with. Um, and we're a global organization. I think earlier you mentioned the offices we're in, and um, owned by private equity, so I'm really not allowed to divulge certain things around numbers and
Sure.
stuff. But
No worries.
well over $100 million organization
Yeah.
with roughly 500 employees and
Employees.
about
Yeah.
350 of the brands that you would recognize for sure.
Yeah, and global, as we
Yeah,
mentioned
yeah.
in the introduction, U.S., U.K., Australia, the Philippines. Are you looking for expansion as well to other global other locations?
Well, I don't know that we necessarily need to put boots in the ground right now. I mean,
Yeah.
the Beeline solution is in over 80, 85 countries right
Wow.
now. So
Wow.
it's a SaaS platform, right?
Yeah.
So we represent ourselves geographically, and right now I'm fairly happy with how we are, but who knows what the future brings.
Yeah, yeah, terrific. And
Thanks.
so tell us a little bit about that evolution then for you from a career standpoint. You kind of went to this product management group, you kind of figured that out, and then did you kind of grow up, through the ranks with the company, taking on different levels of responsibility? Give us a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of that career path.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm not sure I figured out product management, but good enough at the time, right? And again, it was early days, and we were blessed in that we won J.P. Morgan Chase and Merrill Lynch almost
Ah,
at the same time.
wow.
So I have to give them credit for figuring out product management. I mean, as you can imagine, these behemoths that are at world class, but very demanding for all the right
Right,
reasons.
right.
So when the head of sales left the organization, my heart was really in sales, and I asked if I could
Mm,
bump over there and run the sales organization, which I did, and had a ton of fun.
yeah,
And the sales cycle was very, very long because there's still a lot of education that had to happen back in that
right,
day.
right,
And then I progressed through. I always had a vision, kind of interesting around. I think it's interesting around what we call total talent management today. So I was pushing to go by an organization, which we did, which back then was succession planning, learning management,
mm,
performance management, all that. And we even bought an applicant tracking system organization. So I had these grand ideas of kind of one-stop shop, but frankly, back then, and interestingly, right up the corner from us was Verve, which Taleo bought. So that was a big applicant tracking system
right, right,
organization. And so by that time, Taleo had kind of won the game in terms of ATS, and we and a few others had won the game in terms of VMS, as we call it, vendor management software. And unfortunately, some of those designs I had of one-stop shopping just weren't going to take off. I mean, you had the success factors just destroying it out there, and a bunch of
right.
other organizations focused on their niches doing great. So
Yeah,
we stuck to our knitting. We
yeah.
kind of jettisoned some of those early acquisitions and just focused on the external workforce and really never looked back.
And from that head of sales position, were you reporting into the C-suite at that stage, part of the executive team?
I was on the
Yeah,
executive team reporting into our president at the time, and then
right,
I became a general manager because that's when I was bringing in the performance management as
right,
well. And then he left in 2010.
right.
Adecco bought us in 2010, and put my hat in the ring, and been there ever since.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, so much of the culture of a company does really emanate from the CEO, but broadly the C-suite and the folks that have influences there. Tell us a little bit about the Beeline culture and what it is that defines you folks, and how do you go about communicating that, particularly to folks that are joining the organization and keeping that fresh.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's everything. It's the most paramount thing that you could focus in on. And it's funny when you said culture. I was talking with my head of marketing yesterday, and her mom calls it the cult. I hadn't even really thought about cult and culture being in the same word until you
That's
said it that
interesting,
way.
isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah, I
right.
mean, good and
Yeah,
bad, right? I mean, you
yeah,
have to be
right,
careful
right,
that you don't drink too much of your own Kool-Aid.
right.
However, I'm a firm believer. I'll take B plus talent any day over A plus talent if that B plus talent knows how to get along with
Yeah,
people and
good
empower
fit.
them versus
Yeah,
cowboys. And
right,
so
right.
we have 9 principals at Beeline that we hire to, and we talk about them a lot, and the organization knows them well. And so, from a culture perspective, it's not just lip service to say we're people first. I believe that in the industry. I believe that manifests in our product, but most importantly, it manifests at home with Beeline.
Yeah,
And it really is a family environment, which candidly isn't the easiest thing to do, when you go from like 30 to 500.
Right.
I used to know everybody's names and their kids, and that no longer is the case. And
Yeah.
COVID
Yeah.
certainly has challenged that even more. But
Right.
I will tell you, it's our secret sauce. And I know that sounds a little bit cheeky, but it's interesting when we have people visit us, prospects or clients, they get the feel, and they're like, man, it's just a company that really cares about each other and their clients. And we've always tried to figure out if there's a way to bottle that and market it. I think we do really well. Helping people understand who we are. But it's a hard thing to do. It
Yeah.
it manifests in customer conferences. I think in just day-to-day, excuse me, interactions.
Right.
But I think unless you're in it, it's hard to really understand just how special it is at
Yeah.
Beeline.
Well, in the last year and a half too, particularly during the pandemic, you probably continue to hire new people, et cetera, and with a much more remote workforce, it's hard. It's really hard. I know a lot of the CEOs do struggle with how to go about communicating, the importance of those principles. So you mentioned the 9 principles, and I want to ask you to recite them. But how were those developed? Was it something that you did broadly within the organization with the your executive team? How did those come about?
No, maybe it should have been, but frankly, what happened was I got the role and I spent a lot of time thinking about the changes I wanted to
Yeah.
effectuate within the organization and some of the areas that we should highlight and some of the areas that maybe we should do less of. And so I just sat down with pencil and pen and or paper and said, all right, what are the principles that I feel would be important for the
Right.
organization? And I came up with 9. And some of my obviously drew from the mentors that you raised earlier in the
Right.
conversation, lessons learned. And it's funny because I've had folks say, we can't remember 9, it's too many. Like I'm not asking you to, right?
Yeah. Right.
It's a parlance, it's a language, it's a way
Yeah.
we think,
Yeah.
and frankly, it's a shield sometimes. When, for example, one of them is customer centric, but that everybody has that, and I always challenge people like if you'll just abide me for a moment, my definition of a customer is anyone who's not me. And so
Mm.
we're obviously going to take care of the Microsofts of the world and the Amazons and the Facebooks and all the other great clients we have. That's a given. But do we take care of each other the
Yeah.
same way? And
Yeah.
invariably we don't. So if we look at
Mm.
each other as customers and treat them that way, then we'll have a superior culture and a better organization.
Very
Um,
important. Yeah. It can be kind of a checklist, right? I mean, go and
exactly.
keep it something on your desk or, something on your computer now. I guess these days, nobody keeps paper around much anymore.
I
But being
do,
able
but
to yeah,
no, you're
well, you
right.
and me both. But
For
but you know
sure,
what I
yeah.
mean.
I
It's
do.
being able to have kind of that reference and be able to check against that. Yeah, that's cool. What
Agreed.
what would you say is kind of the most unique feature about the company culture, if you had to kind of boil it down to 1 or 2 points?
Well, I always say to folks, if you don't like the word love or it makes you uncomfortable, this probably isn't a place for you to be. And
Mm.
and, and, and that's not for everybody. I totally
Yeah.
subscribe to that. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't impose that on anyone. But I feel most gratified. Each year we do engagement surveys, and there's a lot of comments, and I read all of them. And trust me, they're not all good. But those that are typically center on this organization has my back,
Yeah.
both professionally and importantly personally, and especially as I contemplate the last 2 years and the amount of loss we've suffered, even within our organization, but with the extended family, which is their families. It's been hard, and
Yeah.
this is a company that's like, it doesn't matter. Go do what you got to do. We got your
Right.
back, and we're going to do
Right.
what we need to do here for each other.
Awesome. That's
Yeah,
terrific.
thanks. I think so
That's
too.
great. Growing up in Procter, and I'm a few years older than you, I recall the bosses that I had, and Procter, a lot of great things there, but very patriarchal organizations and
Okay.
command and control, and you didn't question much about what your boss had to say. You just kind of went out there and did things,
Sure.
and that's evolved. That's changed a lot, and I've heard it recently said that some CEOs, can be somewhat uncomfortable with having their answers questioned, right, rather than their questions answered. And do you find that in your organization, particularly with the younger workforce, that there is a kind of this quality of, well, gosh, challenging management on the decisions that are being made or perhaps the directions that are being gone, and when that happens, how do you deal with that? How do you kind of incorporate that into your thinking?
It's a great question. Look, there's two responses. Sometimes I get a little defensive and like, just
Yeah.
fucking do it because I told you to. Like,
Right, right. It's hard not to have that response.
yeah,
Thank you for being so honest, Dad.
totally. Same generation, right? Like I wasn't asking all my bosses that. Like, just go do it, man.
That's right. That's right. Because I
But
said so, right?
exactly. But I think to your point, like we have to be perpetual learners, and clearly
Right.
the generation of our kids is they don't ask those questions with arrogance. They ask with genuine curiosity,
That's
which is
right. Yeah.
beautiful, right? And so
Yeah.
we've got to
Right.
get out of our own egos.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to tell you I do this all the time, but typically we try to be very transparent and help people understand the why. And often I say, guys, I have the right to make what you consider to be really dumb decisions. But to be fair, I have a different perspective and a viewpoint and a bird's eye view of what's going on.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I get that in your department, this is frustrating or it may be dumb. But if I can help you look a little bit more broadly and connect the dots, and that's all they're really looking for.
Yeah.
And I don't
That's
have
right.
time to do that all the time.
Right.
But again, transparency is big in the organization. So if it's not me, it should be other leaders. And we do our level best for that. I won't tell you, we're hitting home runs all the time, but we're striving to be transparent and help them understand the why. And it's just good training and development for them as well.
Yeah, and I think if you have that feedback loop too, right, where
Hmm.
there's the opportunity to come back and let's talk about what you found, or let's have a discussion around, your way of thinking.
Hmm.
So often I've found that again, that younger generation, we won't call them millennials because we don't want to be too specific here, but
But we all know what we're calling.
but we all know what we're
We're
talking
talking
about.
That's
And
right.
and if we're in a situation where we have that opportunity to do those loop backs, it again kind of reinforces that, yeah, hey, they listened, and I may not have gotten my way, or I may not have seen things the same way, or I may not still see it,
Agreed.
but having that ability to be inclusive there. Tell us a little bit about kind of the evolving of your leadership. Now, we can go as far back as your early days at Beeline, but I would say that you had obviously some very formative things that happened at Pillsbury and in Conagra, and I know those organizations well. I recruit very often from them because we do a
Oh,
lot of work in
interesting.
the consumer products field. But if you had to kind of say, looking at your leadership arc over the course of your career, what would have been the key changes you've made, that
Hmm.
have learned in terms of how to really work and lead with people today versus, maybe what you're doing 20, 30 years ago?
That's interesting. The first one that comes to mind actually was when I was at Conagra, and you remember they would send us through these 2-3 day psychological reviews to see how
Right.
far you could go and are you a hypo.
Sure.
And I remember vividly, I had this great counselor, and she basically came back and said, "You got the chops to make it, but you're
Mm.
not going to be happy in this environment." I was like, "What are you talking about?"
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
And she said, "I'm just telling you, you lead from the heart, and I want you to read
yeah,
this book, which I think is called Leading from the Heart, something like that." At any rate,
yeah,
she said,
yeah.
and culturally, you're going to run into dissonance, and you're going to have to sacrifice part of yourself. And if you're
Isn't that
comfortable with that,
interesting?
you should keep going. And if you're not, you should make a change. And it hit me like a ton of bricks because
Wow.
I loved the people I worked with there. And
Yeah,
she was right.
yeah,
I knew it, right? Intuitively, I knew it. Um, and there were certain things, and they weren't egregious, but there were certain things that were done over there that didn't really pay
yeah.
attention. In fact, I remember we all had to skip Halloween and do some work, and I had like a 2-year-old kid, my son, and it just seemed wrong to me. And so I thought we were in a safe environment, and they asked for feedback, and I said, "Yeah, I thought that was kind of uncool," and they laughed me out
Kind
of
of
the room.
looked at
Like,
you. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh,
And I
wow.
was like, all right, it's cool. Like that's your environment, but that's not
Yeah.
really where I'm going to thrive. So I made a
Right.
major change, and then I guess moving closer to now, I like the way you state that the arc is. I think about it much more data driven
Mm.
than
Mm.
instinct driven.
Mm.
I've
But you
come to
still lead
realize
with your heart because you talked about love and the importance of that in the culture. So
I
you haven't
do.
lost that, huh?
No, but I think it's important. It can't blind you, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
look, when we merged with another company years ago, you have to go through what they like to call a synergy exercise, which of course
Right.
is firing people, and it was it just is, right? And it's terrible. I mean, it's
Yeah, it's hard.
horrible,
It's really hard. Yeah.
and it's necessary,
Yeah.
right? And so I think you do that with compassion and understanding, and know that people will be mad at you, and you're going to be the target, and that's okay. That's the job you're in, but you still have to do it. And one of the things I talk to my executive team frequently about is, I love your perspective, but are we suffering from the law of small numbers? In other
Mm.
words, when you say clients all want, you lost me because you haven't interviewed all the clients,
Right.
because that's impossible, right?
Yeah.
So you have
Yeah.
an opinion. It's probably well informed, but I would love for you to back that up with 7 or 8 or 9 more data points before you
Right.
come in with just total conviction.
Big generalization. Yeah.
Exactly. And we're all prone to it. I do it too, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I've really had to check myself and realize, look, I'm wrong a lot.
Hmm.
And if I'm wrong a lot, I'm guessing those around me are wrong a lot as well.
Right.
And so let's
Right.
just keep driving to the truth, even if that can be somewhat uncomfortable and a bit inflammatory when we mix it up with each other. And I think you want that in your team, right? Like, I
Sure.
mean, as long as you go have beer afterwards and love each other, it's all good. But
Right.
but yeah,
Right.
it can get a little prickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Got it. I told you I was going to bring this back up, so I am going to do it now. We were talking just before the podcast on how this book that you shared with me, and those of you that are thriller and who done it book snobs and enjoyers as both Doug and I are, By Way of Deception by Claire Hoy and Victor Ostrovsky, which I think is a real life version of well, it is a real life version of a Mossad agent. And we were talking a little bit about how, or at least my reaction as I was reading this book, on how much his real life experience formed the basis of so many of the books that I've enjoyed that have been written in fiction. So my question for you is, are there books out there in things that you rely on from a leadership and management standpoint that have really helped form kind of your, approach in terms of how you lead and develop people?
Yeah, I don't actually remember you saying that exactly, so I'm feeling a bit caught off guard, but that's okay. I remember you said you're going to bring it back, but I didn't know you were going to throw that zinger at me. I love to read, and part of the problem is I'm really bad at remembering all the titles, so I've actually resorted to, now I've got all these journals, and I write notes down just frequently and abundantly because in my age I know I'll forget them. So,
Right.
when I think about one of the early books that really formed me, it was First Break All the Rules.
Mm,
And that focuses on helping people do what they're really good at and don't expect them to do what they're not good at. You have to compensate
right.
for that,
Right.
right?
Right.
There's
Yeah.
also the behavioral economics I find incredibly fascinating of thinking fast, thinking slow, and Kahneman and Tversky's work in terms of how we make decisions, which is probably where I even got the law of small numbers because they have just, gosh, scores and scores of heuristics about how we think, which I find incredibly fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, those are the ones that are coming to mind.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm reading an amazing book right now just called FDR, and it's a big one because I don't feel well educated on the presidents of the past
Right.
and these enormous challenges. Or I just read the Churchill one. Like, imagine,
Yeah.
we get all freaked out about a pissed off customer or a
Yeah. Our
product that went
supply
down. Yeah,
chain, problem.
exactly,
Right.
right? And like in their world, people are dying and sailors are
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
so I'm
People are invading your
fascinated.
countries. Right.
Yes. And how do you, with equanimity, look at that situation and still, with compassion for your countrymen, but still with the, as I just said earlier, kind of a mindset of data, look at
Right.
what's in front of you and what decisions are necessary, and I don't know if you even know this, but I didn't know it. I should have, but like Churchill bombed the French Navy because he was afraid that, not the whole Navy, but this certain sector, he was afraid the Germans were going to take over, and
Wow.
the French said, we're not going to move our boats. And he's like, and he wept as he
Yeah.
bombed them.
Yeah.
Not great for relationships, but had the bigger picture
Yeah. Of
in
protecting
play.
the,
Yeah,
the
so just
homeland.
I'm
Yeah.
fascinated by people who are have these types of decisions in front of them and how they deal with them.
Right. And what a great way to kind of open up your mind as well to different approaches on how to solve
Agreed.
problems. Yeah.
Totally
Awesome.
right. Yeah.
Awesome. Now you've seen a lot of growth obviously during your time at Beeline, and the terms of starting in the very beginning and now with close to 500 employees. What do you look for when you're looking to make bets on people that you are investing in and hiring into the organization?
Well, I guess it ties back to the principles, right?
Hmm.
I'm hoping that everybody's interviewing on those principles, but
Yeah.
if
Do
you
you
were to
share
ask
that
me,
with folks? Do they kind of know the 9 principles as they go through the interview process?
um, interesting question. Maybe I should. The answer is no. I did with one lady who was, I asked her what she's not very good at, and she really struggled. And I said, look, there's no wrong answer here.
Yeah.
I don't want to
Right. Right.
miscast you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I like you. I want to put you somewhere, but I need to understand. And really, what I'm looking for is introspection. And
Right.
for me,
Right.
that's the most important quality because if I know that you can look inside and be adaptable and open to change and know that you're wrong and work with other people, then we can teach you the product and
Yeah.
we can teach you the culture, etc. So that's primarily what I'm looking for
Mm.
in an interview.
Do you have some favorite interview questions that you like to ask?
as I think back on this last one, it's what do you suck at?
Yeah, right, right.
And
Yeah.
it's interesting. I almost don't
Get them
care
to
what
be
they suck at.
vulnerable. Yeah,
Yeah, just
right.
be open with me. If you
Yeah,
can't, it's okay. I've got my answer. It's not going to work here. You'll be successful somewhere else, perhaps, but not here.
right, right.
And then, look, I know what I suck at. I'm acutely aware of it, and that's why I surround myself with people who are amazingly more talented than I am in those areas.
Yeah.
And so that's all I'm looking for is honesty, openness, authenticity, as you said, and self-realization, and that I can work with very easily.
Right, terrific. Well, Doug, you've been very, very generous with your time, and we're just coming up to our last few minutes here. But we always ask one last question
Okay.
of all our CEO guests, and that's kind of what kind of career and life advice would you give to someone maybe that's mid-career, possibly in their maybe late 20s, mid 30s, and thinking about the future. Maybe they've got their eye on the corner office, but really just want to have a great balanced work life and looking to the future. What would you have to say to them about what they should be thinking about in terms of their career and direction?
I love that question. I actually was just on the phone the other day with a young lady in college who's my daughter's good friend, and
Mm,
she was asking something similar.
yeah.
And oftentimes I do get the "how'd you get to the corner office?" question, and it's like, look, it wasn't by design. And so what I would say is, and I'm sure there's far more successful people that knew exactly what they want to do when they got there. My advice is, don't shoot for the corner office. That shouldn't necessarily be the goal.
Mm,
I think what you want to do, what I wanted to do at least, is aim to contribute to the best of my ability and just kick some tail and have some fun. And
yeah.
so I just like go find interesting work. I never grew up thinking I would be operating technology in the extended workforce, but it's really interesting, and we're solving big problems and we're providing a lot of value, and that's rewarding. So we also talked earlier about culture.
Right.
Ensure make that change like I did earlier if you know you're going to have that
Right.
dissonance.
Right.
And then I think the other thing I try to share with people is I think humility is very important. So seek to help others be successful within your organization first, and trust me, your success will follow. It'll ride that wave.
Yeah.
But you and I have both been in situations where there's other folks that are just pushing their departmental agenda, and it can be counterproductive. So like
Right.
help them achieve their agenda, and they'll always help you as well. And I think if you just then put all that together, keep learning, and work your
Mm,
ass off, you'll end up in the right spot, whether that's a corner office or somewhere else.
right. Awesome. Wise words of counsel. Doug Leeby, thank you so much. Beeline of CEO. We appreciate you sharing your journey into the corner office.
Pleasure. Thanks so much. It's fun.